Modern physics lists the X-ray as one of its most important discoveries, invaluable aid in medicine, industry, scientific research. First made public February 1st, 1896, it was the brainchild of Wilhelm Röntgen, a noted German physicist who stumbled upon it while researching with a form of vacuum tube through which he passed an electric current. People everywhere who benefit from the fluoroscope in the detection of tuberculosis and myriad other medical advances and their applications owe a great debt to Röntgen and the rays he labeled X because of their unknown origin. From your dentist chair to stomach analysis and the treatment of cancer itself, the X-ray became a vital tool for the research specialist and the modern medical scientist. For example, with a radioactive cesium unit such as this, hard X-rays produced by high voltages are known to destroy newly grown cells that are found in forms of malignancy. New developments in X-ray production techniques included high-speed methods. In Boston in 1951, there was demonstrated for the first time a machine which developed an X-ray in 60 seconds. With a woman's hand X-rayed, the radiology department of the Massachusetts General Hospital showed how the developing technique responded in this test of the 1-minute process. And there was the finished X-ray film. Wilhelm Röntgen would have been amazed at the strides that had been made. Army doctors at Fort Knox, Kentucky in 1955 lifted the wraps off a new atomic medical aid, a portable X-ray unit powered by a tiny piece of radioactive thulium, a rare metallic element. Set up quickly, the machine produced its revealing picture with but brief minutes consumed. In heat of battle, emergency medical assistance, often life-saving treatment are called for. The medics no doubt would find a portable unit of this type invaluable in finding broken bones or detecting foreign bodies such as bullets in tissues. On a very large scale, industry has used X-ray of 2 million volts for testing materials. In 1957, a device big enough to X-ray a diesel engine was unveiled at a California naval base. In its first demonstration, it was used to detect a flaw in a bomb. As conclusively as your dental X-ray, it showed the experts exactly what they wished to determine. Yes, Wilhelm Röntgen would have been amazed. The groundhog, or woodchuck, a small mammal of North America, is known to winter in his burrow. His long, coarse fur doesn't appeal to stylists, but its hibernation and yearly emergence to observe the weather had made it the star of a popular American legend. Reportedly, Pennsylvania Germans started the legend that on the 2nd of February, the groundhog awakens from his long winter sleep, which leads to the Quarryville Hog Lodge, or the full name, the Slumbering Groundhog Lodge of Quarryville, Pennsylvania. For more than a half-century, the Lancaster County community has celebrated Groundhog Day in honor of, as the lodge tells us, the lowly animal which is the one and only true weather prophet. On February 2nd, they have been known to observe the groundhog emerge from its hideout. The lodge members are professional and businessmen, farmers, and just plain folk that like a bit of homespun fun and frolic once a year on Groundhog Day. Their charter will tell you their aims are to preserve and revere the folklore of their ancestors and to glorify the groundhog, which of the entire animal kingdom is the only one to have a day named in his honor. News film of past years shows the great moment when the little fellow was looked for to come out of his home in the ground. At last, patience was rewarded, and the unique weatherman poked his broad, flat, whiskered head out where his friends could see him and offer their salute. "Let us sit by the side of the groundhog hole," recited the members, "and wait for the prophet who knows, who can tell when winter is over and gone and done with its ice and its snows." So indeed the greater moment came for weather prognostication, groundhog version. Legend decreed that if the sun were shining when he came out of his burrow and he could see his shadow, the groundhog would be frightened and crawl back into his hole for 6 weeks more of winter hibernation. Had the day been cloudy, he'd remain above ground, confident of continuing mild weather. One year, it was February 2nd, 1947 to be exact, a home variety of radar was employed by the slumbering Groundhog Lodge to serve as a directional pointer in locating the fellow when he came out of hibernation. That they bowed to modern invention was again evidence of their credo to enlighten contemporaries and coming generations on the value of normal relaxation and clean, wholesome fun. Young Mr. Groundhog felt that he and his shadow already had the weather situation well in hand. It's cold out there. Charles Evans Hughes, on February 3rd, 1930, named Chief Justice of the United States. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, shown here, inducted Mr. Hughes into the highest judicial office in the land. The Supreme Court consists of the Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. It is the guardian of the Constitution, and under Charles Evans Hughes, the High Court was piloted through the greatest unfolding of constitutional powers since John Marshall's days. His distinguished career included tenure as an Associate Justice, Governor of New York State, membership on the World Court. He was drafted as a Republican presidential candidate. In the Harding administration, he became Secretary of State, sat as Chief Delegate and Chairman at the Washington International Arms Parley. From news film archives, President and Mrs. Harding are shown leaving the conference upon its conclusion. Secretary Hughes astonished the participating world powers by boldly presenting a detailed plan for scrapping of ships. Charles Evans Hughes' policy on Latin America was one of liquidating imperialism, and as Secretary of State and later as U.S. delegate, sat in on conferences of importance to inter-American relations. In 1941, at age 79, a long and so very distinguished career of public service ended. Hughes was retiring from the post of Chief Justice. No pictures were taken inside the White House when he visited President Roosevelt, so the camera photographed him again as he came out, ready for retirement at Cape Cod, Massachusetts. There are many news film cameos to recall the life and times of one of the distinguished jurists of the world, who died August 27, 1948, at his New England retreat. Most notable in recent years were the occasions when, upon his birthdays, he permitted the newsreel cameraman to accompany him on his walks. His era and achievements had bridged the 19th and 20th centuries. The newer generation of the 1930s and early 40s was to recall him mainly for his wisdom at the helm of the Supreme Court. It was he who said, "We are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is." In other words, interpretation of the cherished document handed down by the Founding Fathers. He spoke of the rights of free people and abhorred the bigot.
Rancor and bigotry, racial animosities, and intolerance are the deadly enemies of true democracy. There can be no friendly cooperation if they exist. They are enemies more dangerous than any external force, for they undermine the very foundation of our democratic effort.
United Service Organizations, the USO, the civilian morale force, which through recreation centers and organized entertainment brought servicemen relief from boredom. Since its founding, February 4th, 1941, it has served in war and in peace in behalf of those who man the bastions of democracy on distant fronts of the Pacific and European commands. Figures for its first 5-year period were as staggering as the great world conflict itself. At its peak, there were upwards of 3,000 USO operations. Expenditures were nearly $6 million a month. 700 shows were given daily overseas and in the USA by 4,900 entertainers. Incredible as it may seem, during the first 5 years after its founding, USO served 1,100,000,000 men. Small wonder when even a rainy arena spelled happy interlude for fighting men. From the post-war years into the Korean conflict and beyond, the USO has sent a staggering variety of entertainment overseas. This was the Korean front in the early 1950s, where again young America was far from familiar comforts and means of entertainment, and where the USO again rushed in to fill the breach, with entertainment ranging from Shakespeare to jazz bands to the popular favorites they enjoyed so much back home. Every showstopper was a welcome sight, and the boys sure let that be known. If there was ever any doubt as to the value of the camp shows, now known as USO shows, news film revealing the faces of the GIs as they reacted to the performances and then returned relaxed to their duties has certainly provided proof positive for those back home who have supported USO with their dollars. The cameraman was at Kimwa, Korea in October 1951 when graphic scenes unfolded of entertainers and audience. And note that the seating was an ingenious affair at the outdoor theater. Favorites of Hollywood and Broadway journeyed to such far-off places as Formosa. To meet all of the needs of the total USO program would still require more than $12 million annually. On today's anniversary, news film recalls the USO birthday attended by Mamie Eisenhower in 1953, the well-earned tribute expressed in song.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
North Sea storms and high tides inundated the lowlands of Holland and Belgium and lashed the coasts of Britain, France, and Germany. By February 5th, 1953, the east coast of England was one vast scene of flood desolation. It was Britain's worst natural disaster since the plague of 1664 and 65. News film made a graphic record of havoc caused by the fantastic storm which tossed ships and shattered break walls and sea defenses. Americans who had known the awful impact of floodwaters shared the anxiety and discomfort of the British coastal towns. Red Cross societies the world over responded with offers of money and supplies. Thousands of head of livestock perished. A few stranded cattle were seen crossing to safety on dikes, but many were drowned. Refugees were brought to safe haven to be provided with food, shelter, and clothes. Even while Britain cared for the homeless, new reports told of 250,000 acres flooded, and that Belgium was facing mounting losses in lives and property. Many cities like Ostend and Antwerp sent out word of the staggering blows dealt by the fury of water and wind. Hardest hit of all, the Netherlands. Her famous dikes, which through 500 years had protected her, were broken in scores of places, allowing the sea to roar through on a destructive rampage. 1/6 of the country's area, including some of its most fertile farmlands, and the homes of 1 million inhabitants were covered by floodwaters. It was the nation's worst water disaster since an inundation of 1421 took 100,000 lives. Every able-bodied man available worked to bolster and sandbag the remaining dikes, an almost hopeless task with an ocean of salt water already past them. Whole towns and cities were immersed by the sea, which had come in so swiftly and terribly. Millions of acres patiently reclaimed were ruined as farmland for years to come. As best they could, the Dutch cared for a tremendous army of homeless. Tiny Holland indeed took a terrible blow from her ancient enemy, the sea. King George VI of Britain. Death ended his reign February 6, 1952. He reigned 15 years, 1 month, 25 days. His coronation in May 1937 made headlines not alone for the traditional splendor of the event, but also that he had become king upon the abdication of his brother, Edward VIII. Seldom in the public eye before becoming king, George VI and his queen, parents of 2 lovely princesses, with Queen Mother Mary at their side, won loyalty and acclaim in Britain and the Dominions. When George wed in 1923, his bride was the first commoner to marry an English prince in direct line of succession to the throne since the 17th century. King George and the Queen posed with Franklin Roosevelt, the president's mother and wife, in 1938. They were the first British rulers to visit North America. At home, he spoke of peace.
Without freedom, there can be no enduring peace, and without peace, no enduring freedom.
In Britain's darkest war days, he was an inspiration to his people. Amid the devastation of Coventry, his very presence helped strengthen the British will to fight. Historians noted that with his family, he stayed in London and shared war hazards with his subjects. The war over, George was happy in his family. In this attractive cameo, the baby is Princess Anne, the sturdy boy, bonny Prince Charles, who was to become heir to the throne. The king showed signs of failing health when he bid Princess Elizabeth and her husband, Prince Philip, Godspeed as she began a royal tour in the monarch's behalf. They were to journey to Australia via East Africa, thence to New Zealand and Ceylon. Elizabeth had already taken over many strenuous royal duties, relieving her father at a critical time of his illness. It proved to be a final farewell. He was 56 years old. 6 days later, he was dead, less than 5 months after undergoing an operation for removal of a cancerous left lung. At Nairobi, in Kenya Colony, Elizabeth had been making her last tour as a princess. It was here that word came of her father's passing. She hurried home to London, a queen. Before her 26th birthday, she had inherited the crown as Queen Elizabeth II. For the first time in 115 years, a woman had ascended the world's most exalted throne. George Herman Ruth, baseball's immortal babe, born February 7, 1895. A Ruthian clout by the Sultan of Swat were among familiar phrases when the Bambino connected for a home run. He set an all-time record of 60 round-trippers in 1927. The golden era of sport in the 20s knew the hearty, swashbuckling athlete as one of its more colorful figures. He did everything in a grand manner. His bouts with the scales were almost legendary. An orphan himself, the babe never missed a chance to cheer up a sick or crippled youngster. No American of his time was such a favorite with children. A lusty, rollicking hero who taught them how to hit, From his big heart, he tried to impart decency, fair play, and some of his own great competitive spirit, along with how to grip a bat. Babe Ruth journeyed to Japan with Lou Gehrig, a fellow great with the New York Yankees, and other baseball luminaries to play postseason exhibitions. Nippon's interest in the game was no less great than Babe's enthusiasm, his ready response to a crowd anywhere. First as a pitcher, then as a batter, he became Mr. Baseball. But by 1935, he had begun his decline. The Babe joined the Boston Braves briefly. 3 years later, made his last big league appearance as a Dodger coach. Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built. In 1948, it was a sorrowful arena, with fans young and old almost hushed. For Babe Ruth was ailing, stricken with throat cancer, and a new generation was there with the old to do him honor. Final honor it was to be just 2 months before his death at age 53. Fans could still hear echoes of his mighty bat, feel his matchless showmanship. But now his famed number 3 uniform was being retired forever to baseball's Hall of Fame, never to be worn again by a player of the New York Yankees. The greatest drawing card in the history of baseball. His memory would be enshrined with other mementos and reminders for all to see, to recall the sport's greatness which was his. The Bambino's affection for kids. The homer would go that-a-way. Never to be forgotten was the magic of his bat, the 76 records he set or tied, the record earnings his profession brought him. Quite a guy was the Babe. Joseph Cardinal Mindszenty, Catholic primate of Hungary. In a mockery of justice, he was sentenced to life imprisonment by a so-called People's Court in Budapest, February 8, 1949, for treason and other offenses against the Hungarian communist regime. First, the Nazis imprisoned him because he opposed fascism. Now it was the communists. On both occasions, he had chosen to oppose the forces of hate in defense of Christian religion and morals. This film of the Cardinal was made in earlier days in Hungary, where 6 out of 10 people are Catholics. In 1956, in the last days of October, the will of the populace broke open the iron grip of tyranny. At least for a memorable moment in history, a battle-scarred Budapest belonged to Hungarian rebels. Behind barricades of overturned trolley cars, from rooftops and apartment windows, the Hungarian patriots had fought their oppressors, the dread secret police and Soviet troops. Victory seemed within grasp of the rebels. Withdrawal of their enemy brought smiles to faces too long torn by anguish. It was a victory which won the admiration of the free world, short-lived as it proved to be. In Budapest, headlines announced the ouster of the Reds. For several days, it appeared that even the press might escape Russian domination. For the Soviet bluff included negotiations with the Hungarian military as though it were listening to demands for complete withdrawal. Political prisoners celebrated their liberation by the freedom fighters. Many had been held since the end of World War II. At the same time, Cardinal Mindszenty had been freed from the castle where he was held, 65 miles from Budapest, and brought into the capital on October 31st, 1956, to be restored as the Catholic primate of Hungary. The world could see him for the first time after 8 years of confinement. His voice was recorded, a few words on historic news film.
Hosszú fogság után szólok a magyar haza valamennyi gyermekéhez.
The outside world heard the name, too, of Imre Nagy. He was a Titoist, or a communist who wanted to be independent of Soviet control. The revolt brought him back as premier, but only for the brief days before Soviet reinforcements attacked Budapest and other key Hungarian cities, ruthlessly to wipe out the rebellion. Nagy was arrested, later tried, condemned, and executed for aiding the revolt. The American legation in Budapest gave asylum to Cardinal Mindszenty, putting him beyond the grasp of the Red regime. He arrived with heavy heart, his prayers and blessings for the Hungarian patriots who had showed matchless heroism and the great will to be free. The French liner Normandy. Upon her maiden voyage in 1935, she was acclaimed the pride of the Atlantic. A $60 million luxury ship of upwards of 83,000 tons, she attained a speed record of just over 32 knots on her best crossing in 1937. Spectacular demonstrations, such as a smokescreen, were part of the great era when shipping companies vied for blue ribbons and the flourishing tourist trade. Then came World War II and a flaming disaster, February 9th, 1942. The fire at her Hudson River Pier in New York was reportedly started by sparks from a worker's acetylene torch, while the Normandy was being converted into a Navy auxiliary after seizure by the U.S. government. "1,500 men had been working under wartime speed-up to convert the Normandy. The fire raged through the upper decks. Rarely had Manhattan witnessed a more spectacular fight against a ship fire. One civilian worker was killed, and at least 200 civilians, sailors, and Coast Guardsmen were injured. The battle went on through long hours. Smoke blacked out the famed skyline. Officials at the scene included New York's firefighting mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia. The listing ship rolled over on her port side during the night, and this was the scene confronting salvage experts at daybreak. 18 months later, the greatest salvage job on record, costing well over $3 million, reached its stirring climax. Night and day, the operation had been rushed by Navy and civilian divers and crews. The Normandy was to rise again. 100,000 tons of water spilled out in pumping operations. It was a slow, tedious task. Inch by inch, the mighty Normandy lifted from the clutch of river mud. She rose from 79 to 50 degrees, up about 43 feet. Watch. The film will be speeded up 1,440 times normal, showing in about 20 seconds what it took 20 hours to accomplish. Up she went. By November, the Normandy was no longer a crippled hulk. She was leaving her berth upright, headed for dry dock. But past glories were gone forever. The giant had been saved from the grave, only to be doomed to the junk heap upon the end of the war. Lady Liberty looked upon her for the last time. The New York skyline in 1946 looked upon a post-war spectacle which was strictly a matter of the heart. War brides were ending a sentimental journey. The excitement of their first sight of the wonders of Manhattan matched by anticipation of the eager welcomes that were awaiting them. They arrived almost literally by the shipload, with the peak hit on February 10th, 1946, when 1,666 British war brides and 668 offspring comprised the largest overwater movement of women and children in history. It was a sort of lend-lease in reverse, and it looked like Uncle Sam was getting a good bargain. First meal on American shores. The Red Cross made sure Daddy would receive his family fed and relaxed. It was estimated some 70,000 overseas brides and youngsters would be reunited with their dads and husbands. Bravely, they faced a strange land. Once the reassuring sight of hubby came into view, all was well with the world. They must have looked strange in civvies, daddies from all over the land who had waited so long for reunion. Uncle Sam hoped all their days here would be as happy as their first. After the Battle of Britain, mothers-in-law should be a pipe. Anyway, they were hopeful.
I'm on my way to Kansas City, and I feel awfully nervous. My knees are absolutely knocking. I only hope my mother-in-law will like me.
You bet she will.
I don't know what to say. I waited for this for so long, and now we're together. I've read in the American newspapers about American girls. They're not very pleased about English girls marrying American servicemen, but I hope they won't feel too badly about it, as love is love all over the world.
Another transport with 251 war brides aboard. Again, a happy landing on the right side of the Atlantic for waiting Yanks and their sweethearts from overseas. The reunions were as though from fiction, a true love story of ex-GI and happy bride.
Boy, oh boy, now I know the war is over.
That's what you think.
Good, give me a kiss.
Thomas Alva Edison, the wizard of electricity. In 60 years, he had over 1,300 patents to his credit. Born February 11th, 1847, he gave bright new light to the world, and voice reproduction, and images which moved upon a screen, and pictures which talked, so that in twilight years he was seen and heard, reliving significant inventions.
This is a replica of one of the first cotton thread lamps. I designed my original tinfoil phonograph in cylinder form and gave it to my faithful John Crucy to make. He made fun of it. I was almost as surprised as he was when the first model reproduced Mary Had a Little Lamb, which I had shouted into it. Later, I developed both cylinder and disc phonographs. Experiments with the latter took 3 years and cost over $1 million.
This was the 50th anniversary of the phonograph, which Edison invented in 1877. Celebrated, too, with the Golden Jubilee of Light and later Edison patents of motion picture devices. Notables and friends such as Henry Ford joined the tributes in the late 20s. His widow and Will Hayes were present when Edison's kinetoscope was demonstrated on the 50th anniversary of motion pictures. From the peephole gadget grew America's worldwide motion picture industry. Rare bits of early news photography are shown here. The opening of the first subway. Edison gave us the means for a priceless historical record, the News Film Chronicle, without which our archives would be indeed poor. Edison lived to see his original laboratory moved by his friend Henry Ford from Menlo Park, New Jersey to Greenfield Village, Michigan, where it became a permanent shrine that future generations might better know the greatest inventor in history. This was perhaps his last interview for the sound camera.
What do you think of the Einstein theory?
I don't think anything of Einstein's theory because I can't understand it.
How does it feel to be 84 years old?
Well, it feels very fine to be 84 years of age if you don't have anything the matter with you. Well, I have a little trouble now and then, but that's because I'm getting old. But I've got a lot of ginger yet.
His final patent was a process for extracting rubber from goldenrod. Firm believer that the body was young when the mind remained young, he was active until death at 84. The memorial in Washington to Abraham Lincoln, born February 12, 1809. Inside is the majestic statue done by sculptor Daniel Chester French, viewed by many thousands of persons each year since the dedication in 1922. Born in a log cabin in Kentucky, Lincoln was 16th President of the United States at a time when preservation of the American Union became the greatest challenge since the days of the Founding Fathers. Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois. He stands inside the fence in early 1860. Here, the people of Springfield celebrated his nomination the same year. The house is now a national shrine. March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln's first inauguration in front of the unfinished Capitol in Washington. These photographs, reproduced courtesy of the Chicago Historical Society, are among the most notable of the Lincoln collection. Upon the occasion of a year-long celebration marking Abraham Lincoln's 150th birthday, a joint session of the Congress in Washington welcomed the tribute of a famed Lincoln biographer, Carl Sandburg.
Millions there are who take Lincoln as a personal treasure. He had something they would like to see spread everywhere over the world. Democracy. We can't find the words to say exactly what it is, but he had it. In his blood and bones he carried it. In the breath of his speeches and writings, it is there. Popular government, Republican institutions, government where the people have the say-so one way or another, telling their elected leaders what they want. He had the idea. He embodied it. It's there in the lights and shadows of his personality. A mystery that can be lived, but never fully spoken in words. We may say, perhaps, that the well-assured and most enduring memorial to Lincoln is invisibly there today, tomorrow, and for a long, long time yet to come. It is there in the hearts of lovers of liberty. Men and women. This country has always had them in crises. Men and women who understand that wherever there is freedom, there have been those who fought, toiled, and sacrificed for it. I thank you.
February 13th, 1943, the World War II U.S. Marine Corps Women's Reserve was formed, and its first director was also the first woman Marine Major, Ruth Cheney Streeter of Morristown, New Jersey. She recognized the importance of her assignment in the total war effort.
I am greatly honored to have been appointed director of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, and I am sure the women of America will welcome this opportunity to be of service to this famous organization of fighting men.
Major Streeter's command wanted recruits from 20 to 36 years of age with at least 2 years of high school for enlisted women, from 20 to 50 with a minimum of 2 years of college and 2 years of business experience for officer candidates. Women Marines performed non-combat duties at posts in the U.S. and Hawaii, ranging from machinists to secretarial and clerical billets. They received the same pay as men of equal rank. As each job was filled by a woman, a male Marine was freed for active service. The wartime high of the Women's Reserve was 22,000. There was never a dull moment for the Lady Leathernecks. Making a pretty picture, they went touring in amphibious tractors in New River at the Camp Lejeune, North Carolina base. Far cry from World War I, when they were enrolled for clerical duty only. They were known then as Marinettes, and only approximately 300 were enlisted. This was graduation day for 56 women Marine officers. Major Streeter, who was to rise to full colonel, took the salute of the new lieutenants at Mount Holyoke College, Massachusetts in May 1943. The women had been recruited from every state of the Union, and there was pride in the great tradition of the Corps of which they were now a part. Receiving their officers' bars, each pinned on by a woman private. Their commander handed out their orders. Colonel Streeter served with distinction until December of 1945, when she retired. In 1948, the Women's Reserve became a permanent part of the regular Marines. Women Marines serve at every major post and station in the continental United States, at Marine Corps Reserve and recruitment offices, and in the Hawaiian Islands. A limited number have European assignments. On this anniversary, the nation points with pride to its women in uniform and the quietly efficient service they perform. President Woodrow Wilson. Following World War I, Europe had acclaimed him as Wilson the Just. He reviewed our victorious troops after the armistice, secure in the belief that the ideals and spirit he had imparted through his historic 14 points would provide a foundation to save mankind from another such war. He went to the Paris Peace Conference with the 14th point the keystone of his new world policy, a general association of nations formed under specific covenants to guarantee political independence and territorial integrity to all countries. The Peace Conference had been summoned to meet in January 1919. Delegates from 30 countries involved in the World War had been invited. Wilson was one of the big four of the Great Parley. The others were Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, and Premier Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Woodrow Wilson envisioned an association of nations, League of Nations, which he believed would substitute collective security for international anarchy and prepare the way for a lasting peace. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the famed Hall of Mirrors, included the covenant or constitution of the League of Nations, the draft of which Wilson presented to the Peace Conference February 14, 1919. A priceless news film record was made of the imposing setting in the Hall of Mirrors. Wilson had achieved his ideal. He had been allowed to have his main point, the League of Nations embodied in the Treaty of Peace. But there were rumblings awaiting him back home in the United States. Historians have noted the Senate's objections in the wake of the Paris Conference. Isolationists subjected the Treaty of Versailles and the Covenant of the League to one of the most prolonged debates in the history of the upper house. Thus it was that Wilson took his case to the American people, against the advice of his doctors, made a national speaking tour. But the treaty was defeated in the Senate. America did not join the League of Nations, which at Geneva, Switzerland, found its permanent home. The League's quest for peace was doomed by the growth of dictatorships and the resumption of an international armaments race. The United Nations was its successor. 26 years after Woodrow Wilson failed to secure Senate approval of the League Covenant, the Senate ratified the UN Charter. The United States now pledged itself to cooperate actively with other nations in the maintenance of peace. The Charter drew upon the experiences of the League, borrowing some features from it and improving upon it in many particulars. The United Nations functions in a world where, even as in Wilson's time, confusion and crisis call for reconstruction to achieve enduring. 17 days before Franklin D. Roosevelt became president, he encountered in advance that ever-present peril which goes with the power and glory of the highest office in the land. On February 15, 1933, the president-elect was en route at night to New York, having just left Vincent Astor's yacht on which he had spent a restful 10-day holiday. He drove into Bayfront Park at Miami, Florida, for a brief stopover. Some 10,000 persons were there to greet him. Standing in an open car, Mr. Roosevelt made an impromptu speech.
Mr. Mayor, my friends of Miami, I am not a stranger here, because for a good many years I used to come down here. I haven't been here for 7 years, but on my coming back, I have firmly resolved not to make it the last time.
Roosevelt finished his talk and prepared to drive from the park. Then, the startled crowd suddenly realized what had happened. Pandemonium reigned, and the spectators, led by American legionnaires in their glistening helmets, pounced upon the assassin, later identified as Giuseppe Zangara. Mayor Anton J. Cermak of Chicago, who had stopped at the running board to greet Mr. Roosevelt, was carried out critically wounded. Secret Service men hurriedly took Zangara into custody and whisked him off to jail. Heroine was a woman who seized the assassin's arm, probably saving Mr. Roosevelt's life. Mrs. W.F. Cross of Miami.
My first thought was to get it. I knew he was shooting at the president, so my first thought was to get the pistol up in the air so he wouldn't hurt any of the bystanders. When the first shot was fired, I realized he was shooting at someone, and I taken my right arm and pushed the pistol up just as hard as I could. And the gentleman beside of me pushed it up, helped me push it up.
Mayor Cermak, who later died, said to Roosevelt, "I'm glad it was me, not you." Anarchist Zangara paid with his life for the crime, which he attributed to hatred for the rich and powerful. Had Mr. Roosevelt been his victim, the consequences, considering the times, might have been more disastrous than the imagination could picture.